Vanessa, it's always both terrifying and completely refreshing to have conversations about sexism, right? It's something that you and I grew up with. I talk about my experience going to an all-girls high school and having a women's studies class in that school. You talk about going to an all-women's college and being a female athlete. There is so much that is baked into what we talk about and what we do that then ends up going back to this common theme of sexism and what it looks like and how we handle it, not just in our own lives, but as parents and as healthcare providers, right? So there are a zillion reasons why Joanne Finkelstein should have been invited to be on our podcast and is now in this conversation with us that you're about to hear. They all tether to the fact that sexism has evolved. It looks familiar to those of us who are of a certain age, but it also presents really differently in today's world. And it's important to talk about it and think about it through the lens of tweens and teens and young adults today.
Joanne has a doctorate in clinical psychology, and now she's a private clinical practice, which is really rooted in her work and training in understanding how bias, social justice, and mental health intersect. And her book, Sexism and Sensibility, really unpacks sexism in a modern way and helps those of us looking to empower and guide kids in the current world of social media and Brandy Melville and all of it. She's both realistic, empathic, and steadfast in exploring today's sexism and how we can guide kids through it. This is a really fascinating and illuminating conversation we hope you enjoy. Hi, Joanne. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
Cara's giddy with a copy of your book over her right shoulder. The Sexism and Sensibility is like glowing neon next to her.
I feel like in my senior year of high school, I took a women's studies class. I went to an all-girls school, and this was like the class that everyone fell in love with. And I feel like if I was in that class today, we would be reading this book.
That's what I like to hear. That's sort of what I'm hoping for, right? That it makes it into classrooms.
Well, let's do our best to spread the word, and then let's see what happens. So, Joanne, I'm going to start with a question that I really honestly cannot believe I have to ask, but it's actually more salient than ever before.
Than when I was in high school?
Than when you were in high school or when I was at Wellesley, where every class was a women's studies class. How is sexism still a problem in the modern era? Like, how is this possible?
I know. Well, it's very much a problem in both big and small ways, right? The numbers don't lie. Women continue to be systematically underrepresented in decision-making processes that shape their societies and their lives, right? So modern democracy, medicine, the justice system, the nuclear family were created by and for men, right? Despite women depending on them too. So it's really hard to change because it's so ingrained in our society. And, women are underrepresented in healthcare, in research, in car safety tests, and, other life-saving entities. They earn less than men. They face more negative attitudes. Their body autonomy is under constant threat, including being less safe in their own homes. And pretty much most women feel badly about their bodies, right? So, of course, there's been progress. I mean, men don't legally own us anymore. As of 19...
There's our win, Joanne. We're not chattel anymore. Fabulous.
As of 1993, a husband can't legally rape his wife. We can work, wear pants, play sports, have our own credit cards and bank accounts and businesses, right? We've come a long way. And we're better off than many women in many other countries. The problem is we're supposed to be grateful for what we do have, rather than these like nagging ingrates who expect full equality. The progress that we've made is used to shut down the work still to be done.
You know what I love about the way you just delivered that message? And it's the way you write. You're not yelling and screaming at anyone. I mean, you're so measured and clear, but also hopeful and positive, and just showing people the path through here, which also feels different in the modern era, right? I mean, we do have the luxury of not having to have our fists up and be screaming and yelling all the time, right?
Yeah. I
sort of beg to differ a little bit, and as we record this in October of 2024, but I will take your positivity,
very fair, very
and
fair.
optimism, and pray that, Cara, your positivity emanates throughout this country. But yeah, I think there are new styles and new approaches and new ways to getting the message across, to making change. And Joanne, your book is one way. And we're going to focus the conversation on girls and sexism and what they encounter. But one thing I really appreciated, and listen, I have 3 boys. Cara has a son. She wrote a whole book about decoding boys. So it's obviously near and dear to our heart. It's also half the population. And you talk about how sexism is also really detrimental to boys. And before we really go down the path of girls, I would just love it if you could talk about that for a minute.
Absolutely. I mean, we hear so much more about the effects of bias and stereotypes on girls and on boys, because girls are the ones who are marginalized, right? Who have less safety, autonomy, less opportunity. But boys absolutely suffer too because of masculine stereotypes. And so what I've come to understand, because I have a boy, because I see boys in private practice, in my psychology practice, right, is that we need to raise boys differently, not just to protect our daughters, which is one of the reasons, but to protect our sons too. Right? My male patients struggle with so many of the same issues as my female ones: anxiety, self-esteem, friendship, romance, identity, depression, feeling misunderstood, all of that stuff, right? But unlike girls and women who often disclose problems to close friends or family, a teenage boy or even a grown man is often confiding in me, a psychologist, before anyone else. Mm-hmm. And we all know it takes a lot before people will go see a therapist, right? So like these deep and meaningful conversations that girls are able to have are really rare among boys. Boys have this way that they pretend that they don't want connection as this kind of like masculine ploy to find connection, right? And then if they are affectionate or they give a compliment, it's usually followed by a quick like punch in the arm or like no homo, right? Just to reassure anyone within earshot that they're not gay, right? So there's this boy code, right? Which inhibits them from building meaningful relationship with other boys and when they get older with women. Right? It steals so much. Like, I mean, really, I could write a book about this, except there's so many good books. It steals so much of what makes life purposeful. Connections to others, giving back, building a legacy made from, that's made from more than just money.
I just want to jump in and say one thing I see as teenage boys get into young adulthood is much more expression of affection without that code being tacked onto the end. Hugs, hello, love you, man. Things that are, and I don't know if that's that times are changing or that this is sort of the natural evolution of things, but what does exist, and so much of this podcast is aimed at showing parents and trusted adults the light at the end of the tunnel. What exists at the end of the middle and high school tunnel does seem, at least to me and the boys that I know, to shift and change as they head into their later teens and 20s. And Vanessa, I see it with your kids too, right? We visited them at college and it was a hug fest with their friends.
It is interesting. I mean, I think, Joanne, some people might argue that because we all do this work, that possibly our boys are somehow benefiting from us not letting them get away with not expressing their emotions and by keeping it inside and not, not being affectionate and all of that. But there is a lovingness about boys. And I think that's actually where we all need to start, is assuming that they are loving human beings who seek connection. And then they will, with that permission and that sort of pathway open to them, figure out the ways in which they want to be loving and connected. And it might be very different from how we might choose it for them, or, expressed in different ways. But I just want listeners to think about, we're going to have all these conversations now about girls, but not to sort of keep their boys to the side as they think about how this might affect their boys too. And I just appreciate your acknowledging it. We had Ruth Whitman on the podcast, who's written a lot about that. I mean, what I wouldn't give to have you and Ruth in conversation together. I'm guessing somebody's done that at some point, right?
We do have some stuff coming up, and we did a few events together early on.
I love that. So we're going to move into some kind of specificity, and throughout the conversation, Joanne, as much kind of guidance and strategic advice and practical skills you can offer up for our listeners. Because the thing about sexism is that it's like, we all know it's there and we're aware of it. But then when the rubber meets the road, it's kind of like, how the heck do I deal with it? How do I address it? So, Car, do you want to dive in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with your favorite expression, a million tiny paper cuts, Vanessa, because it's so applicable to this scenario, right? Sexism rears its head in zillions of ways, but each one taken individually can sometimes feel like you can explain it away, or you can blow it off, or it's fine, I can deal with this. And so that's not always true, but largely, if everything gets explained away, we don't deal with the sum of the total, which is massive, right? And so can we start with advice that you have? Let's start with parents of younger kids, maybe school age and middle school age kids. What can parents do on like kind of a micro level, if you will, to help prepare their girls for the myriad of sexist encounters that they're going to have on a daily basis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the whole goal of my book is to prepare girls for what they're going to encounter in the world, so that they don't blame themselves when those psychological paper cuts accumulate.
Mm-hmm.
And what I really want them to understand, and what I want parents to teach their kids, is that the culture is broken. They are not broken.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts at home with making sure that we're treating them equally, because even the most progressive of us have unconscious biases that we're passing on. So we want to make sure that we're not placing emphasis on their appearance, and we want to focus instead on their character, their creativity and ideas. We want to notice when they're being interrupted, because statistically speaking, girls and women get interrupted far more than boys and men, right? And then letting them know that does happen, and that it's not okay, and that their thoughts matter to us. We want to notice when we're relying on our sons to do physically harder work, even though it's crucial that our daughters get that experience of physical accomplishment too. Because if they're treated as whole and serious human beings at home, it's going to feel wrong when they're not treated that way out in the world. But it also means talking to them directly about sexism and unfair treatment that they'll experience in the world. I worried about making my daughter feel inferior or like a target. But I think by relying on everyday teachable moments, and I give about 1 million of them in the book, right, we can introduce sexism in more palatable ways. It's not the best word, but in ways that... Go ahead.
Right. I'll give you a really silly little example in my own house. The day that I realized I was telling my son it was his job to take out the trash and to bring the trash cans back in from the street. And I had assigned my daughter, like everyone in the house has jobs and whatever, but there's no reason why lifting trash cans, lifting trash bags into the trash can and then hauling the trash cans down to the street should be the male job. But I did that for years, very unconsciously. And then I caught myself. And then I started telling my daughter that was now her job. And she was thoroughly offended, right? Because it was like not the job she wanted. She was good with the jobs she had. And that was not the job she wanted. It wasn't about it's a male job, it's a female job. But I think that's one teeny tiny example, right? Of something where we tend to layer on this, if you're stronger and you can carry the trash cans, then you should do the trash can carrying.
I noticed the same thing. Like when my kids were really young, I would ask my son to come help carry in the groceries. And I'm like, okay, they're 2 years apart. They're not that much different in strength. She's perfectly capable.
Right.
And she needs to learn that she's capable.
I want to give you another scenario, and maybe you can give parents some guidance on this. So one thing we talk endlessly about on this podcast is that all kids are entering puberty 2 to 3 years earlier than they used to. And girls, their development is evident to the entire world because their breast buds are the first sign of physical development. Their growth spurt is earlier in puberty than for guys. And they, at 10, 11, 12, 13, look much, much older. And if they're walking down the street and people are looking at them, making comments to them, I'll give those people the benefit of the doubt that they assume these girls are actually like older teenagers and not the age they are, although that's,
generous.
I'm not sure that's the right assumption, but let's just say you have a tween or young teen who looks much older and is moving in the world. What is the conversation we have with our girls in that scenario where we want, as you mentioned earlier, we want them to feel empowered. We want them to feel confident. We want to foster their sense of independence and self-sufficiency. And yet it's really scary because we're worried that people may, do or say things to them. What is the roadmap for that conversation for parents with their daughters?
Yeah, it's really tricky because, when we worry about their safety, especially when it comes to clothing, they hear it as slut shaming.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So yes, parents often find themselves between a rock and a hard place, right? Wanting them to learn that girls deserve full bodily autonomy while also keeping them safe and making sure that they understand free choice isn't always as free as it seems.
Okay, so Joanne, we're going to get to slut shaming because that is a favored term amongst young people, which I cannot believe is like now a term we all use just generally in our culture, but that's fascinating itself. But before we get to like how girls dress, what can a parent say? Like your kid is starting to, ride the public bus by themselves or walk to school by themselves. What can we say to our girls knowing that they may pass groups of people or strangers who may say or do something to them on their way to their, regular activities? How do we prepare them for that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we just have to be really honest, right? Your body's starting to change. And when girls' bodies start to change, they start to get noticed more. And it's unfortunate because they're often noticed for their sexuality at the expense of all their other wonderful qualities. And so it's very likely that when you're walking to the store or you're walking to your friend's house, somebody will comment on your body and it's not going to feel good and it's not okay, but it is not your fault.
Joanne, what if it does feel good?
Mm-hmm.
What if they think it feels good? Like they think it's the kind of attention they want.
If we're talking about catcalling on the street, I think it rarely feels good. I think it almost 100%. Always feels threatening. But yes, getting noticed for your body can feel good. And we can acknowledge our kids' sexuality and sexual energy. It's a normal part of adolescence. It's a normal part of being human, right? We want to be noticed. We want to we want to feel attractive. So we're, I guess what we're doing is we're wanting to acknowledge that at the same time as saying, but it's your body and it has to feel good to you. And if it doesn't, you have every right to speak up or come talk to me about it. And we'll deal with it.
And should they say something back? Like, what if somebody says like, hey, pretty, smile, or why don't you smile more? Or like, nice
Oh my
ass.
God,
Or
I remember hearing that on the street. Why don't you smile more?
remember, I still get that. I'm like, really?
Well, and the thing is, it was a strategy for me. I don't know if this was true for you, Vanessa, but like looking a little aggro was my
Fierce.
strategy. Fierce, yes, was my strategy to get people to not make a comment, which is so fascinating that then you would get shamed for having that strategy in place.
Oh, interesting. I don't think it was purposeful. I think I was just like
You just
naturally
came into the
aggro.
world.
But Joanne, like, what do we say to our girls? Are we like, hey, if somebody catcalls you, tell them to off? Like, do we say that, or does that put them at more risk? Is that more dangerous? Like, how do we navigate a response to it?
Yeah, and I have a whole section in the book on catcalling and what we can say, because a lot of most of us, many of us, freeze up and we don't say anything, and then afterward we're like, oh, I wish I had said something. Teenagers can be a little bit more brazen and and just like say F you,
right?
And so I think what we're doing is we're emphasizing safety first, right? They should be able to walk away with grace if that feels like the safest way to do things. If they're assessing, like really being able to assess that the situation is safe, they're with a lot of people, or the guy is 3 stories up and their car and their ride is just driving up. Maybe then they swear at the guy, or they find a way to shame him back and say, what if this was, what would your mother think of you saying that? And so we can actually give girls like 3 or 4 things that they can have up their sleeve that they can say, so that they feel empowered to have a comeback if it's safe. But honestly, most of the time, it's safer to just ignore it and walk away. And sometimes the goal is to get a rise out of the girl. And so if the perpetrator needs a nod or a smile, then you do that too. But the goal in the end is that they don't internalize it. They don't think, I somehow brought this on. They know that something is wrong with the culture.
Okay, so can we then hold 2 things to be true at once and talk about it? So one is catcalling and unwelcome comments or looks or whatever.
Touches.
Right? All of it, touches. Okay, so the unwanted bucket here. And then let's go all the way over 180 degrees to the evolution of beauty culture and, tweens who are at Sephora and 12-step skincare routines and the beautification that keeps sort of marching downward in age, and the sort of virality of these beauty routines online. And so this, like, there's always been this conflict between these 2 things. I don't want this attention, but I do want to engage in routines and behaviors that make me look and feel a certain way or fit in or right, any of that. But like, let's talk about it in today's world with social media and all that. How do parents navigate this when both of those things are true?
I mean, yeah, these girls are in formative stages of identity, right? And so there's this the unabated focus on their appearance is this constant reminder that they're falling short or that they could do more and look better. And in social media and every other type of media, right? They're seeing these skinny women with radiant skin and cartoonish eyelashes, and they come to think that these are normal appearances, right? That they could attain to if they just head over to Sephora. And they're willing to plunge like all their financial, emotional, intellectual resources and like just oodles of time into their appearance, right? Girls spend, I think it's nearly 8 hours per week on their appearance, which is like double that of boys. And so, yeah, social media is like a huge driver of this because girls especially are just chronically subject to others' visual inspection, right? And there's, the proliferation of doctored images. And so teenagers they're, like you said, they're figuring out who they are, right? So comparing themselves with others just comes with the territory. But as they scrutinize posts of their peers, they're measuring their like complex, imperfect selves against the idealized online selves of their friends and others, which, is usually this 2-dimensional, highly curated photo much of the time.
So Joanne, how do we both recognize just the developmental stage they're at, right? This is the age of comparison. That was true before there was social media, and phones and that sort of constant inundation. I mean, we had that on our own versions of our magazines and our sort of comparison of other kids at the mall and all of that stuff. Like, that's just the age they're at. And yet it's like over the top, incessant, and they're being marketed to in these new sort of algorithmic, powerful, endless ways. So how do we not disparage them for being age appropriate in their identity formation and their wonderings and their worries and all of that, while also like making it clear that the culture around them is feeding into it and is not healthy for them?
Yeah. And I'll answer that, but I just also want to say, because you brought up peers and magazines, and it's much harder to apply critical thinking skills to images of peers than it is to like celebrities.
Yeah.
And girls forget, right, that
Yep.
that Snapchat's smooth, soft skin filter was probably used, and come to the conclusion that they're just not as pretty or that they need to do more.
Right.
That's a really important point. I just want to highlight it and put an exclamation point at the end, that the exact same face tuning and all that happens on the celebrity level, when it happens on the peer level, registers differently.
It really does.
It's huge.
So to answer what can parents do, right? I cover a bunch of ways in Sexism and Sensibility that parents can sort of approach beauty and social media with their kids, right? And one is helping them tune into their feelings and helping them and sort of encouraging them to have a critical eye. So, on the one hand, you're saying, I totally get that you want to look good. And I want you to also remember that certain images are going to make you feel bad, and they're going to make you feel like you're not enough. And, let's look at some of these and tune into how you feel. Can they stop following an account that induces negative feelings? If it's a friend's account, social consequences might be too high. But maybe they can start following accounts that have like hashtag girl power, hashtag stop sexualizing women. And another way is to share the research with them, right? Again, I totally get why you want to wear this makeup. And it's, there's a whole thing in the book, right, about how I dealt with makeup with my daughter, who is basically a makeup artist and she loves makeup. But I also want her to understand, right? Like, we're in this for the long game. I want her to understand that I want her to become a critical consumer of the culture and to understand what the male gaze is and how we focus so much on women's looks and bodies at the expense of other parts of themselves, right? So we're trying to encourage like these long-term habits. So when it comes to social media, we want them to, we were talking about Deborah Heitner before, right? She says mentor, not monitor.
Right.
And I think that's true. If we throw up all these social controls, they're not going to really know. So we can explain to them or remind them how algorithms are designed to keep them hooked, and can literally identify when they feel insecure or worthless and are vulnerable to advertising because they've paused over a certain ad for acne solutions or whatever.
I mean, Joanne, I think about what you said about makeup artists and, the use of makeup. And one of the things that I've worked really hard as a feminist who grew up, in another generation, we were raised that like true feminists should be like anti-makeup and like don't wear pink, right? We were given all sorts of constructs about what our feminism could look like. And in the journey of raising kids, it made me think a lot about how there was a judgmental nature to my feminism and how I needed to kind of pull some of that away and really get curious. And the makeup stuff is like is a fascinating thing, because it's like, well, what if it's just a creative outlet for them? And what if it's a, sense of self-expression? And that's what I grapple with.
So here's a doozy for you. Is it true empowerment when girls are walking around with very few clothes on?
That is a doozy.
Help me.
Okay. So
asking for a friend.
Yeah, asking for a friend. So, to pick up on what you were saying about choices, because I think it really does tie in here. Girls today, right, they have this budding feminism, which is amazing, right? And they believe all choices are valid and empowering, right? My body, my choice. And really, their willingness to stand up for theirs and others' choices is impressive. And I have learned a lot from my own daughter about that, right? And noticed my own judgment because I grew up with a different kind of feminism. The problem is their mantra lacks analysis and real world experience. They're right? Most choices are valid, but without an understanding of the unforeseen forces at play, they're often not real choices, right? Like, as I once said to my daughter, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, but a crop top, dieting, or Brazilian wax is never as simple as free choice. So my goal has always been to help her think critically about her choices, not to control them, right? Because like I said, we're playing the long game here. We're teaching them to think critically about cultural messages. And sure, we can forbid them to wear the clothes they like and that help them fit in, but that does so little for our relationship with them.
Right. And at a certain point, they're just going to put on the clothes they want to put on. They're going to throw them in their backpack and put them on. Right.
Yeah.
But what I struggle with, and I think a lot of parents struggle with, is where they will sometimes push back in these conversations when you get to the point where you can have open conversation about it. I just had one of these conversations with my 21-year-old whose clothing choices are 100% and entirely her own. I don't live in the same state as she lives in, right? We are so far from any, sort of the fiction of control over those choices. And yet sometimes when we talk, she will say, this is my power. Like, my choosing to wear this thing is, this is how my friends and I exert our power. And I find myself stuck. I find myself, because really, Vanessa talks a lot about leaving your own baggage at the door. I have trouble leaving this baggage at the door. Sometimes I see what they wear and it's my baggage about what the filter I put it through. And in her world, where she does not have a ton of lived experience, you are 100% right. She has not yet faced decades of being in vulnerable or dangerous situations.
Mm-hmm.
She and all of her very bright friends feel like they're taking the power by dressing how they want to dress, however that looks.
And I just I know I just can't wrap my head around it. Like, I get how it's dressing that way is like putting yourself out in the world, and because you think maybe it feels sexy or it looks sexy or you're sort of in style. Like, and by the way, I would never have this conversation with my kid. I would just say, like, oh, well, let's think about like what reactions you're going to get out in the world, and are you prepared for that, and how might that feel? But like, Joanne, help us wrap our heads around how young women feel empowered by revealing more and more of parts of their bodies that we think of as sort of private, to be shown only to certain people.
I mean, I think it's really complicated because on the one hand, they're sort of buying into the culture that they're buying into the culture that their main power lies in their sexuality. So, right, your daughter's not wrong. That is a way of exerting power. But we want our daughters to understand that that's not actually real power. Real power lies in decision-making power. Real power lies in economic power. So I think, fine, if they want to go out and they feel good and powerful, great. But they should also know that that is not real power. And so that's one way to...
Is it not real power, or is it only one form of power? Because I also am wary of like, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, like sexual power, feeling powerful in a sexual context, feeling emboldened and like you have a voice and like you have a say and like you have a choice in how you are, physically intimate with someone else or sexually involved with someone else, that to me is power. But I feel like it's a different kind of power than what you're talking about.
Well, I should say it's limited power, right? Because I don't actually think it has long-term effects. It might have an effect on the night or on the lover of the moment, but I don't think it has long-term big power, right? We see too many married women who feel powerless, and maybe their sexual energy, their sexuality is sort of what helped them get into this situation, but it's not working long term. And it's like it's really tied up in this culture. It's ephemeral, right? It's tied up in this in youth, and we're not young for very long.
There's an interesting phenomenon that I'm watching happen at the other end of the age spectrum, which is a makeup-free world, right? There are very, very well-known celebrities who, as they age, have started to say, not only am I not fighting aging, I'm going to take off my makeup and go as my authentic self on the red carpet or on a TV show. And they're sort of building a sisterhood of other people who are willing to do that. It doesn't strike me that this, at this moment, has any influence over what younger kids are doing. But do you think that there's a world in which some of that behavior and sort of people who are closer to our age making those choices will trickle down and impact younger kids? Or do you think it's just, it's sort of where we started the conversation. Do you think it's just the pendulum swing of life experience, and you get there when you hit a certain age and then you're there?
I think a lot of it does come down to self-acceptance, and that's why we cringe a little bit with a lot of makeup or dressing for the gaze of somebody else, because we want to know inside our girls like who they are, they accept who they are. And again, they're more influenced by peers than celebrities, and every other TikTok is a makeup tutorial. So I think it's going to have trouble trickling down. But like in terms of clothing, you were asking, like you were talking about safety. I think it's also like if our daughters do choose to emphasize their body, the reason it's complicated is because in part, sexuality is so demeaned and they're given such mixed messages. So they are in a way saying, I am not going to listen to that message. I am going to do what I want. And this is empowering. And so if they do choose to emphasize their body, like I want your listeners, I want everyone to remember that girls in everything from bikinis to burqas get harassed and assaulted, right? There's no research that says clothing makes it more likely. And the truth is, they're often more interested, especially when they're younger, in being fashionable, not sexy, right? And skimpy is what teen brands are selling. So they feel sexualized by us and become self-conscious and defensive.
Right. I can't help but think about us bringing as Cara said, bringing our baggage into the conversation. And it's interesting that it's not, because I'm so wary of it victim blaming. Like, if you say, are you prepared for what someone would say to you wearing a crop top and jean shorts with your butt cheeks hanging out and a low cut shirt where your breasts are visible and, right. And it's like, again, you keep saying, make sure they know it's not their fault. And I just find it so hard to have a conversation with girls about being critical of how people react to them and what the outside world is. And then having them think about what their choices are without making it somehow critical of them. And
well, it's not free will. It's not a free choice in that scenario.
Yes.
Right. Well, is it free choice if TikTok's telling you to dress that way or Brandy Melville's telling you to dress that way? It's not free choice, and we want them to understand that. But like what I tell parents to share their dilemma with their kids, right? Say, I want you to be able to wear what you want. You're not responsible for other people's reactions. And yet some people's reactions, some people will judge. So it's important to reflect on what story you want your clothes to tell about you. And if her clothing choices are bringing her attention she doesn't like, or, are making her feel unsafe, she should listen to those cues.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of blown away by the fact that we are sexualizing our kids by even having these conversations. Like that's kind of a shocking revelation.
I mean, we're imperfect. You're not, Cara. You're perfect. But the rest of us are imperfect. And we bring our own socialization into all of these conversations. Joanne, we're creeping up on Halloween. Mm-hmm. This episode is being recorded before Halloween. It will come out after Halloween. But I would just love it if you could give some guidance on how to talk about the sexy Halloween costume phenomenon.
That might have been the nature of my conversation with my 21-year-old. Yes.
Was she a sexy nurse or a sexy devil or a sexy
schoolgirl?
No. But interestingly, the way she shared with us what she was going to be was she shared an image not of the costume, but of the character that she was going to be. And it was the opposite of that. And then we made a joke and then said, oh, that's at least it's not sexy, whatever. And then we got the receipt from Amazon showing that the character that basically looks like it's wearing a potato sack and the costume, which involved a bikini top, were quite different. And that was the nature of the conversation, right?
Sexy. So the costume is sexy potato sack.
Yeah, sexy potato. Let's just go with that. Sexy potato sack.
So Joanne, what is that, right? Because it's like their kids are planning outfits together and it's a group outfit and they don't want to be left out and it's exciting and they're roaming around, it's a big social event. So like, how do we have that conversation with kids?
If they're teenagers and they're going to be in a safe space, I think it's more about the cultural criticism and saying, why is it that girls' costumes have to be sexy? There's so many things you could be out there. Mm-hmm. And why does everything have to be made to be sexy? Because again, we're in it for the long game. We want them to start to think like, yeah, why do I need to show skin in order for this to be a good costume?
I'll just say my son is dressing as Patrick from SpongeBob, and his costume is like a massive.
Not sexy, Patrick.
Sexy, but boy, is he going to be comfortable. So, there's that. Joanne, let's close with a conversation about girls and sexuality and pleasure. And you point to a book that we love so much and is a touchstone for us as well, which is Peggy Orenstein's book, Girls and Sex. It's actually one of the things that got me on the journey of all the work that I do. And I know Cara feels the same way about Peggy's work. It's essentially at the core of Peggy's book, it's that boys enter physical intimacy, sexuality with the expectation of pleasure, and girls enter those same situations hoping for a pain-free experience. Mm-hmm. And that just about puts a knife through my heart, because as those of us who have the benefit of age know that in order to have true intimacy, both parties should have pleasure and should expect reciprocity, and that there's like great sex to be had out there if you have expectations of having your needs met. But like, that's a conversation maybe I could have with some older kids. How do we build the building blocks of making sure that's part of girls' expectations in an age appropriate way?
Yeah. This is a good way to sort of wrap up, because fear, it ties in with everything we've been talking about, right? Fear of sexuality is buried so deep in our history, right? We've got witches and chastity belts and now sluts. And so that's why it's empowering, because they're like, there should be nothing wrong with sexuality. And that's the fine line we walk, where we don't want them to think anything is wrong with their sexuality. And yet we want you to be safe and we want you to have self-esteem in other areas than your sexuality. Because there's so much fear around sexuality, we give so many mixed messages about sex, right? Like, be sexy, but don't have sex. Save yourself, but don't be a tease. Sex is proof you're desirable, but boys are only using you. Being involved with a boy makes you cool, but it also means you're desperate or foolish. And so their personal desire and decision-making are clouded by the meaning that we make of it, that others make of it. So I would just say start at a very young age, right? Body literacy is an essential tool in healthy sexual development and for keeping kids safe. Using anatomically correct terms for genitalia shows a child I'm sure you guys have covered all of this in your podcast, right? There's nothing embarrassing about words like penis and vulva. They're just descriptors, no different than neck or foot. And when they know their own bodies, right, they're also more accurately able to talk about their bodies and tell you what hurts. It's so important to affirm their curiosity, their pride, and their pleasure that they show in their genitalia and we've got to avoid shaming them for touching themselves. So I guess ideally we should start having conversations, reading body books with our kids by 5. When they're still open, curious, and unself-conscious. And then a little later, 8, 9, they should understand that their body's going to change. We want to, make the topic of puberty totally ordinary. Like I say in the book, that I wanted sex to be as mundane a topic as pizza, right? So then moving up, as they get older, they start to become more modest, and discussing bodies and sexuality gets a little more touchy. So, by age 12, if you haven't broached the topic, or maybe even if you have, expect to be critiqued and shut down by your kids, right? Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean you don't talk about this stuff when they're tweens and teens. Definitely you do. But if you've been doing it all along in age-appropriate ways, it won't be nearly so awkward. And then by late middle school, it's really okay to talk about different kinds of birth control and STIs, so that when sexual experimenting and dating starts, they can make good choices for themselves. The truth is, most partnered sex isn't about reproduction, but about the pursuit of emotional and physical pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. So telling kids otherwise is dishonest, and they know it. That's why they keep doing it, despite pledges to wait until marriage and warnings it could ruin their life or their reputation. So yeah, even stressing that sex only happens between 2 people who love each other can be confusing, right? I don't want my daughter confusing lust or infatuation with love. I don't want her to think that if someone agrees to have sex with her, it's because they love her, or she has to have sex with someone because she loves them. Right? And so the bottom line is, if our kids feel good in and about their bodies, they're going to know when things feel wrong and bad in other circumstances.
It's a great place to land. Joanne, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing what is such measured and thoughtful and calm advice about something that makes us all scream in our heads, right? But there are ways to be rational and logical and thoughtful about all of this. Mm-hmm. Your book, which, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see behind me, is Sexism and Sensibility. We will definitely put a link in the show notes. We are so, so happy to be in conversation with you. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. This was such a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Joanne. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.